Well, good afternoon to those who are with us online and also to those who are with us live. So this is the Vermont Center on Behavior and Health monthly lecture series, and we are in for a good one this month or today. So we have Ryan Vandrey with us. Ryan's a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. And he is without question a national and internationally recognized expert in cannabis. And as you know, with the legalization of cannabis and for recreational use and also earlier for medical use, the cannabis is really out there in large numbers and we need to know more about it. And so you're going to hear more about it today from Ryan. Ryan has an outstanding educational pedigree. I'm a little biased in that direction, and you'll see why, but he did his undergraduate training in psychology at the University of Delaware, an excellent program, and then joined us at the University of Vermont, where he got his degree in experimental psychology and was part of our T32 training program in substance use disorder, where he was mentored by Alan Budney primarily. And, you know, of course, we're very proud of him. And he was part of some really seminal studies that were done on cannabis at that time, just mapping out its ability to produce physical dependence and withdrawal. John Hughes was involved, and they really did some landmark studies that continue to influence us today and put cannabis or marijuana on the map as a formal substance use disorder. So from there, Ryan went and did postdoctoral training at Johns Hopkins, and he was part of the behavioral pharmacology research unit where many of us were trained. Warren Bickle, myself, who were at the University of Vermont, very, very accomplished training program, and he never left. When he went there, he did some studies in different areas. He did some contingency management research in nicotine reduction, and he and I collaborated in some projects like that. But Ryan never took his eye off of cannabis. He was focused, he researched it thoroughly, and he continues to do that today. And when I reflect on it, I'm just thankful, and I think we all should be, that some scientists have that, because there's so much more we need to know about cannabis and all the different uses that are taking place and with us now. Ryan publishes regularly in well-regarded journals. He's been continuously funded by the NIH. So he's really a gem as a scientist. And so I'm happy that you're with us here today, Ryan, and I want to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Steve. And it's great to be back in Burlington and great to see so many familiar faces and places that I spent so much time at 20 some years ago now, which is kind of crazy. It's still mind-boggling. So I've been looking at cannabis from a variety of lenses for a number of years. And so I think a lot of my work has been focused on human behavioral pharmacology lab studies. And I've done talks about that here at UVM, even just a few years ago through the seminars and retreats and things like that. So I want to do something a little bit different today and focus on a new area of science that we're kind of getting involved with. We're still running the lab studies, but I want to talk about a new program of research that we're working on that's focused on evaluating the health effects of medicinal cannabis use. So I want to kind of acknowledge some disclosures that I do consulting for the industry, and then kind of switch and kind of get us on a platform of understanding and really show you why I think this new area of work is important and valuable. So currently, most US states and many developed countries now have medical access programs for the therapeutic use of cannabis and cannabinoids. And the thing that's interesting and what differentiates this from therapeutic use of really anything else is that it's been legislatively approved. So the whole idea and the concept of using these things as therapeutics really came through legislation and voter referendum. And this supposed singular entity of cannabis is being promoted for the use of dozens of different health conditions, most of which have very little in the way of clinical research and development. The other thing that's fascinating here is that cannabis is not cannabis, is not cannabis, is not cannabis. So when we say cannabis, what do you mean? And so we have a whole variety of plant-derived products that could be administered orally, through inhalation, through topical means, through insertion. We have things that are sold in medically focused therapeutic dispensaries. We have products that are sold in non-medical kind of adult use recreational dispensaries. And we also have pharmaceutical products. So on the bottom of the slide here, a number of pharmaceutical formulations of cannabinoid products. Some are botanically derived, others are synthetic. And so trying to reconcile a particular product category that's being promoted for the therapeutic use of dozens of health conditions, where there's hundreds of different products and different routes of administration, how do we kind of roll that in and try to answer the question, is cannabis medicine, or can it be effective as a therapeutic? So the first attempt at answering that question was done by the National Academies of Science, Medicine, and Engineering back in 2017. And it boggles my mind that this report is now 8 years old. But they did a systematic review, and there were dozens of very excellent scientists on this panel, very well respected. And they found conclusive or substantial evidence that cannabis could be effective in the clinical use of chronic pain, multiple sclerosis, or nausea or emesis due to chemotherapy. And most of that evidence came from the FDA-approved medication dronabinol, which is indicated for nausea or emesis due to chemotherapy, and as an appetite stimulant in people with wasting disorders. Now, shortly after this report came out, Epidiolex, which is a pharmaceutical formulation of cannabidiol or CBD, was approved for the treatment of rare seizure disorders that are typical or common in children. So we have a preponderance of evidence of therapeutic use of cannabis or cannabinoids coming from FDA-approved medications of THC or CBD. Outside of those areas, there's the Academy's report found very little support. And there continues to be very little support in terms of kind of traditional drug development and randomized controlled trials of any cannabinoid therapeutic for any of the other health conditions that people commonly use this drug for. The limitations are the studies that have been done have largely been either small kind of pilot-ish clinical trials. They've been observational studies, they've been case reports, or they've been studies done with isolated cannabinoids like THC or CBD. And the results of those studies won't necessarily generalize to all, much less any particular products that are found in dispensaries. And so in addition to that, we've learned that, you know, the chemical complexity of cannabis seems to be more important. So the cannabis is not just THC and CBD. There are a number of other minor cannabinoids that have their own pharmacological effects, and non-cannabinoids like terpenes and things like that, that also have physiological effects and may contribute to the effect or the effectiveness of cannabis as a therapeutic. So with that background, about 12 years or so ago, I was introduced to a woman named Heather Jackson, who's become a very, very good friend of mine. And her son was one of two child patients that had just this amazing response, clinical response to a CBD oil. And she and Paige Figge, mother of the now famous Charlotte Figge, founded a nonprofit in Colorado Springs that was focused on education to patients and providers related to medical cannabis use. Initially focused on parents and caregivers of children with epilepsy, and now just kind of at a broader level, therapeutic use of cannabinoids for any reason. And what we decided to kind of to get into is trying to collect observational data on patient experiences as they were using cannabis as a therapeutic. And so through Realm of Caring, we built this web-based survey study where we would every 3 months have patients or caregivers fill out a questionnaire based on broad health effects of the therapeutic use of cannabis as people would go through this journey. And our initial cohort of about 1,200 people, we analyzed the data on that, and we used validated assessments of health, like quality of life and pain and sleep and anxiety and depression, things like that, healthcare utilization, and found that when we compared therapeutic cannabis users to non-users, and these were folks, again, using cannabis for a variety of conditions, a variety of types of products, but looking at just the broad health impact of the decision to use cannabis as a therapeutic, we found that the people who were using cannabinoids versus those who were not, and those folks were interested in using it but hadn't yet started. The cannabis users had better ratings of quality of life, had better pain management, better sleep, and better anxiety and depression compared with the non-users. In addition, when we looked at healthcare utilization, the cannabis users were using fewer other prescription medications and were less likely to have been admitted to the hospital or the emergency room in the prior month when we surveyed them. So what we wanted to do from there is to drill down on some specific cohorts of patients, because it was pretty dirty just saying, all right, well, users versus non-users, all different kinds of health conditions. Do we see this at a patient level where it's a cohort that's more common than not? And so when we looked at the patients with epilepsy, we found the biggest thing that stood out to us was that the folks using a CBD oil were not necessarily substituting CBD oil for their medications used to control the seizures, but they were using it as an adjunct. And so while CBD has been shown to reduce seizure frequency by itself, that's not what the patient experience was in the real world. And the thing that stood out that most differentiated the cannabis users from non-users is that they had much fewer medication-related adverse effects. And that translated to that improved quality of life that we saw in the reporting. Another cohort that we looked at was people who were primarily using therapeutic cannabis to manage anxiety or depression. And so on this slide, I want to show you there are 3 groups of folks here. In the black bars, those were folks that when they filled out their first survey, they were already using cannabis and they continued using cannabis. And at a later date, 3 months or longer, they gave us another data point. There's folks in the white bars that were not using cannabis. And even though they were interested in trying it, they never initiated medical cannabis use. And then the folks in the middle, and this is the most interesting group to me, these were folks that we have kind of a within subject comparison over time. These folks were not using cannabis when they gave us our first survey, later initiated medical cannabis use, and were actively using at a later time point. And so you can see this interaction of cannabis use status and anxiety and depression, such that when folks newly initiated medicinal cannabis use, we saw significant, not only statistically, but clinically significant reductions in their anxiety and depression. And what I want to point out in this cohort in particular is that these folks were predominantly using high CBD oil through an oral dose formulation. The Realm of Caring has a partnership, partnership's not the right word, but an affiliation with hemp companies. And that tends to be what they promote use of, rather than high THC types of products. So we're seeing reductions in anxiety and depression in products that have very little THC in them, and prospectively over time in the same individuals. Importantly, we're seeing no difference in the people that don't change their cannabis use and they were never using and didn't use. So there's stability over time in these symptoms. And we did see a little improvement over time in the people who were using at the beginning, or their anxiety and their depression continued to improve. So we wanted to kind of take that concept and look at mood as the state of Maryland began their medical access program in the late 2010s. So around 2018, 2019, state of Maryland adopted their medical cannabis law, and we thought that that would be a good opportunity to take this large survey type study and do a little more intensive data collection and analysis of people new to cannabis. And so what we did is we recruited a cohort of 33 people who were not using cannabis of any type at that point in time, but they were getting certified by the state to get access to it. And they reported that the main reason that they were looking for this was that they had anxiety or depression. We did a clinical interview to show that their anxiety or depression was clinically significant as measured by the hospital anxiety and depression scale. And we did baseline assessments of their mood and functioning, quality of life, and all that kind of stuff, other medications. And then we did an intensive 8-week period of daily diaries and product reporting and effects through a phone-based application. And so we had a baseline EMA period as well as 8 weeks post. And so the cool part about this is we were able to not only look longitudinally at these folks' mood with these clinical assessments, but we were also able to see what acute dosing of their cannabis product of choice had on them and their mood and their functioning. And so these folks, in contrast to the last cohort, which were predominantly using CBD oils, these folks, because they were going through the Maryland program, were seeking high THC products because you needed access to access the dispensary. That's what those products sold. And you don't need the license to get a CBD oil because it's federally legal. So what was interesting is that in the moment, each day, these people would indicate on their phone whether they were about to use their cannabis medicine. It would ask them, what's your mood like right now? What's your level of feeling high? Do you feel impaired? Would you be willing to drive a car right now? And they would say, you know, rate on a visual analog scale or a 0 to 10 scale, something like that. And then if they were inhaling the drug, about a half an hour later, their phone would prompt them to answer the same questions again. And they would take a picture of the product that they were using and indicate the dose that they took. And so we have oral dose, inhaled dose, and on inhaled, whether it was smoked or vaporized. And so you can see with these folks, when they were using, generally they were using at a point where they weren't impaired. This is self-reported feeling high. And then after dosing, they were all using enough of a dose of THC where they felt moderately high. But what did their anxiety and depression do? Acutely, we saw reductions in anxiety and depression in these folks on average. What was also fascinating is that this cohort of individuals tended not to use cannabis every day. So the idea conceptually, at least for us going in, is these folks would just adopt cannabis use and do it multiple times a day, every day. And that wasn't the pattern that we saw. So these folks were using on occasion kind of PRN, so to speak, and using it when they felt their anxiety or depression was kind of getting to a point where it needed to be managed. And they would feel an acute THC drug effect, but it would also help with their anxiety and their depression. The dose that they were using, we see an inverted U shape in terms of dose. So too small a dose, 1 to 5 milligrams, really wasn't cutting it, especially for the depression group. And then too high a dose was causing too many problems. So the sweet spot was in the middle, somewhere from 6 to 15 milligrams. This is with oral dosing. We don't have actual milligrams for THC when it was inhaled, but we see the same kind of thing when we look at the number of puffs that they took. And so there's a range, and you see that bell curve that you would normally expect to see with this kind of thing. And then longitudinally, this cohort got better over time for 6 months, where it went from clinically concerning levels of anxiety and depression below the clinical threshold in terms of concern on the hospital anxiety depression scale that was maintained for a 6-month period of time. So again, small cohort, different kind of cannabis product, but a very similar outcome. So this kind of gave us a signal anxiety depression is something interesting. I fully expected to see anxiety get exacerbated by these high THC products, to be honest. So again, this is why we do the science. We need to try to figure this out. So we wanted to try to take this concept and do it on a larger scale. And we really needed to figure out, 8 weeks of intensive EMA is a lot for somebody to manage. It was intensive. We lost participants as we went through that. So we wanted to try to figure out the feasibility of doing this kind of thing on a bigger scale. Now, concurrent with us doing this project, my colleague Johannes Thruel had gotten an R21 to look at cannabis and opioid use in chronic pain patients. And he was doing an evaluation of EMA kind of feasibility and acceptability for longer term in larger cohorts of people, and was able to show that in a chronic pain patient population using both opioids and cannabinoids, that he could get really high rates of adherence to daily diaries. Momentary assessments were a little bit less often, but if you structured some different contingencies and you got some feedback on what was okay and how they would be able to do it, we kind of figured out that we might have a sweet spot in terms of the intensity of the EMA monitoring, the compensation needed to get people to do this for a little bit of time. And then he also got clinical efficacy data and looked at substitution of cannabinoids for opioids or combinations of these things in this chronic pain patient population. And one of the interesting clinical outcomes was that on days that the patients used both cannabis and opioids, again, these are non-daily users of either, they reported the greatest relief of their pain symptoms. Cannabis only was the next greatest rating in terms of pain relief perception, and opioids alone was last. And so we're seeing differential use of medication across days and different clinical outcomes based on what they're using. So we kind of took that and said, all right, well, this is interesting from a research design standpoint, and also another signal that therapeutic use of cannabis can be not only helpful, but also can potentially help replace opioids in a clinical context of terms of pain control. Now, concurrent and separate to our interest in patient reports of therapeutic effects of cannabis and cannabinoids, we were also very mindful that there is a lack of quality control of the products available to patients. And that was something that they reported back to us in many instances. So I tried this one product, it was great. I went and bought it the next time and it wasn't the same. So the continuity of the content of these products is not always great. And sometimes the same looking product can have very different chemical constituents. And so the cannabis industry, especially even going back 6 or 7 years ago, really lacked quality control assurance. There was, I think the industry was still finding its way in terms of quality control. There were some businesses that had people that came from pharma and knew how to do quality assurance and were doing it well. And others just had no interest, and there was no governing body forcing them to do this. And so our lab and a number of others have done some kind of surveillance product purchasing and analysis tests. And you find documentation of all kinds of contaminants in these products, whether it be heavy metals, pesticides, other drugs, or unlabeled products. We also see misleading and unsubstantiated claims on the labeling of a lot of these products. So what we did is we ran a couple experiments, and I'm going to just highlight a couple of them here. One was CBD oils sold over the internet. We tested 84 different products and found that most of them had inaccurate cannabinoid content labeling. And so not only was it mostly inaccurate, but the range of CBD doses per milliliter of liquid was astounding. So we found a range of just above 0 to 800 milligrams of CBD per milliliter of liquid in products that look and are advertised and marketed largely the same way. So when you think about that from a patient perspective, I'm going to go, well, CBD oil is what my provider told me. Which one do you get? What dose are you going to get? And is that dose going to be reliable over time for you? And we've seen again over and over patients saying it used to work and now it doesn't. Well, what product are you using? Oh, I switched brands because this one was cheaper. Well, that one's cheaper because it has a fraction of the medicine in it. So that's an issue. And then we reran this just a couple years ago with topical products and found basically the same thing, just a huge range of CBD content in these things. And the level of accuracy relative to the labeling was just shockingly poor. So you can see that the in between these two dotted lines here, that would be within a 10% level of accuracy of dose label accuracy, and all but about 6 products are outside of that range. The other thing that we found in that CBD product testing is that 35% had THC in them, and most of them claim to be THC free. So you're seeing products having inaccurate labeling with regards to whether or not there's THC involved. A lot of them were making claims that, again, were unsubstantiated anywhere. So all of that was kind of a background to kind of help you understand our path to getting to this current platform that we've been developing. It's called the Cannabis and Health Research Initiative. So the NIH issued a request for applications about 3 or 4 years ago now, looking for people to develop a patient registry of medical cannabis users in the US. And so we had been doing a lot of this kind of stuff, and we're like, that's us. Let's do it, but let's make it more than an observational study, a patient registry, because we've been doing these EMA things. We've been looking at product testing and surveillance. And so we cobbled together a really large team of interdisciplinary folks at Hopkins. And this might be hard for you all to see details. So I'm just going to kind of talk through what we've pulled together and how we're structuring this thing. And a ton of credit goes to the co-PI on this project, Johannes Thruel. He's a public health expert at Hopkins, and he was the one doing that EMA stuff, and really helped steer the vision for this program. And so what we have is we pulled in Realm of Caring. So they're like the patient interface kind of group that understands patient needs, understands the products that they're using and the problems that they're dealing with. We pull in Johannes, who's got the expertise in use of EMA, our experience with doing large observational research studies through web-based platforms. And then we pulled in some other folks. We found through the process of pulling together this grant that there was a whole core center at Hopkins focused on doing research through electronic health records. And that was just a resource that we hadn't even considered really in our prior work. And so we were able to get a hold of a guy named Paul Nagy, who leads that core. And he opened up our eyes to the fact that there's a global network of universities and institutions that have developed a platform for doing research in electronic health records, and that they're one of many. And so he told us what they were able and capable of and being willing to do. We got an expert biostatistician. We pulled in a couple businesses that are brokers for connecting medical cannabis patients of interest to providers that can make recommendations on what products to use and how to use them and get state certifications. And so we've leveraged a relationship with them to recruit people into our projects. And so what we really have done and what we sold to NIDA is what we would do with this is we would do this big observational patient registry survey study online. But in addition to that, we're going to do this on a large scale. So our first one with Realm of Caring over 8 or 9 years, I think we collected 3,000 people. We're now proposing to leverage and over the 5 years get 10,000 patients, but all of them newly initiating medical cannabis because we're getting them at the time that they're seeking licensure or some approval for the state to be able to start using it. We're going to take a subset of those folks and have them do 1 week bursts of EMA around each point of assessment. So before medical cannabis use, 1 month after, 3 months after, 12 months after. So we're going to prospectively follow people for a year and see if those trends that we saw in our Maryland cohort where things were still looking good at 6 months, does that still look good 12 months out? Because I don't know if you noticed, things were starting to kind of come back up a little bit at that 6 month time point. Is this effective in the short term or is it long term? And then we're going to do biomarker assessments. So we're going to take people and have them come in and we're going to, before they start medical cannabis use, we're going to get blood chemistry and a pretty detailed analysis of that kind of stuff. And then we're going to do that again 1 year later. So how does liver function look in these folks? How do inflammatory biomarkers look? Diabetes risk and all of the things that we think about on a global health perspective, but making it objective rather than subjective. Because a lot of times there's an internal bias of protecting your decision as a patient to be a medical cannabis user. Do the biomarkers match up? And then in addition to that, we're going to continue our program of product testing and analysis. So we partnered with Mahmoud El Soli at the University of Mississippi, who's been just a stalwart in cannabis research for forever. And he has this wonderful laboratory. He can analyze any product for anything and quantify it in a beautiful way. And so we're going to take this and try to do 2 things with it. One is we're going to look at representative product types and get random sampling of these things sent to his analysis, just as a general market kind of pulse of how good quality control is now, because we know that the industry has kind of been pushing and promoting. There are laboratory standards starting to come out. And then we're going to try to get actual products from people in our studies who report adverse effects and try to determine if some of those adverse effects are driven by product mislabeling or contamination or some other aspect of these things not being what they thought they were. And then, as I was starting to allude to, electronic health records work. And so we've got these wonderful collaborators in the Hopkins School of Medicine core research group, as well as in the computer science department, that are developing large language models that we can use to kind of go in and evaluate the clinical notes in the Hopkins electronic health records and identify which patients are medical cannabis users and which ones have no mention of cannabis use at all. Then, as we're going through these observational studies and tracking patients that say, hey, I'm new to cannabis, I've got anxiety, I'm going to be in your study and I'm going to use this product. When we start to develop those cohorts, if we start to see those same types of changes, we can then pull records from cohorts with a particular diagnosis from the Hopkins electronic health records. You run these large language models to determine whether or not they've used medical cannabis based on clinical notes analysis and see if we see the same kinds of things in a much larger sample. And in addition, look at healthcare utilization, concomitant medications, and all of the stuff that's captured in the EHRs. So we should be able to look at this on just a huge, broad look of health and see what we've got. And so I want to talk and take maybe the next 15 minutes or so to drill down on some of the details and some of the early products of this project. So one is assessments. And so one of our main limitations right now, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, is you've got hundreds of different cannabis products that contain a variety of different concentrations of different cannabinoids. How do you quantify that in a meaningful way? The validated assessments for measuring cannabis use behavior up to now are very poor given the current environment and what's happening and what's available for sale in dispensaries. So we've taken a lot of what Alan and Jake have done in terms of identifying a variety of products through their web-based surveys, our experience with the Realm of Caring group, and developed a cannabis use questionnaire that captures all of the different product categories that are currently available for sale. We differentiate route of administration by chemical composition in terms of identifying if it's a THC dominant, CBD dominant, or other type of cannabis product. And then each route of administration or product type has its own unit of measure. And so, for example, oral dose, you get milligrams per milliliter, milligrams per serving. That one's easy. But inhaled products, you get percent THC, percent CBD. We're capturing the number of puffs people take. And in our laboratory work, we've been collecting puff topography on adult use behavior for men and women of a variety of ages using different kinds of products. So we've got puff topography on vaporized and smoked cannabis, and with known total THC doses, and looking at differences in puffs across a sequence and a bout of administration. We're doing some math to try to figure out on an average adult male, how many milligrams of THC is in the first puff versus the second puff versus the third puff you're vaporizing versus smoking things. And so our hope is to develop an algorithm that'll get us quantitative THC levels through this method of data capture. So where we're at now is we've developed the measure. We've gotten feedback from patients over a number of years through Realm of Caring, and we're currently doing a test-retest validity analysis of the measure. And we've programmed the entire measure, which takes a participant, depending on how many different kinds of cannabis products they use, anywhere from 2 to 10 minutes at the most to complete with all of this detail. But the actual measure is hundreds of pages of code. We've programmed it into both REDCap and Qualtrics. And so what we're looking to do is to disseminate this. Once we're done with the test-retest validity analysis, which should be done by the end of the month, we are willing to share this measure with anybody who wants it, and we'll be looking to publish it and get the whole validation out there. But anybody listening who's interested in this measure, let me know, and I can export the REDCap or the Qualtrics coding to you, or share the details if you're building something on your own platform. The other thing that we want to do is to promote kind of core assessments for broad aspects of health and functioning. So as I mentioned, we've been doing this stuff with Realm of Caring for a while. Obviously, we have an interest as investigators on 2 different projects of integrating data across those projects. So we started and we went back and we did a very careful analysis. You know, there are probably 4 or 5 different measures of sleep that are validated and commonly used. There's 4 or 5 different measures of anxiety and depression that are validated and commonly used. Well, which ones are best for this? And can we get more people doing observational studies to use common measures so we can combine data sets and look at a larger pool of data to help get to the health impacts of medicinal cannabis use? And so we convened a number of people who were kind of content experts in the field, got their ideas on, well, first of all, what should be part of our core assessment battery? What health endpoints are we interested in? And then do an analysis of which validated measure should be selected and why. And we focused on the accessibility of the measure. Does it cost anything? Do you have to get a license to use it? Is it translated in multiple languages? We looked at the validation, the prevalence of use in published peer-reviewed journal articles, the adaptability of it to medical cannabis use, and the brevity, because we want to minimize patient burden on all of this. And we came up with a list of assessments across a number of health domains, being quality of life, functioning, general health and well-being, pain, mood, sleep, motives for cannabis use behavior, the expectancy, what do you think your medical marijuana is going to do for you, as well as cannabis misuse. And so this core assessment battery, again, these are all validated, readily available assessments, except for this cannabis use questionnaire, which was the prior slide. And again, willing to share that with folks. So we want to encourage people to if you're newly developing any kind of therapeutic or medical cannabis research studies, to consider using these assessments. And again, we're happy to share REDCap or Qualtrics programming of any of those assessments to minimize the burden on the researcher side of things. And what we're doing beyond this is we've established a data repository. So all of the data from our realm of caring work, all of the data from this Cannabis and Health Research Initiative project is going to go into the repository. And we're going through the process of actively seeking other researchers and other states that have collected data to go into our repository. The more people we can get using common assessments, the bigger the data set, the easier it is to integrate, and the better we'll be able to answer our questions. So going back to our longitudinal observational research study, I talked about this a little bit. We're getting, again, web-based surveys, EMA, biomarkers, and product testing throughout the course of a year. What I didn't mention is that we have money to compensate people for doing these this time. So in our realm of caring, it was just people volunteering because they were interested in helping science. The value of this is that in our realm of caring, we had retention rates of about 25% over time. We hope that now where we can compensate people for doing all of these things, each one of those things that we ask people to do has a dollar assigned to it. And so we're hoping to have much better retention over time. Where we are currently, and this is one of those things kind of where, God, if I would have known, would I still have done this? But just a kind of a note to everybody involved and anybody else considering these remote data collection kind of things. So we built this whole huge thing, and it took us months to do all the programming for all of this analysis. We did 2 soft launches to work out the bugs and the kinks and all of this stuff. We got 70 patients enrolled, engaged, passed all the attention checks and the surveys and this and that. And we were like, all right, we got all the programming bugs worked out. We're ready to go. We're about to launch this massive media campaign, and we got cyber attacked like something crazy. All of a sudden, overnight, with no new advertising, we got 300 new participants. The next night, 400 new. The next night, 1,000. What's going on? So someone caught wind that we were giving out $25 gift cards, and we're trying to sabotage our thing to get the gift cards. Now, thankfully, at the beginning, we required a manual review of data for accuracy and validity before we would issue the gift card. So they didn't get any of our money. But what we had to do is go back and rethink all of our security. Now, we were savvy to the security need going into this, but the level of sophistication for these bots and these folks coming in, they programmed something that was specific to our survey, so that everywhere where there was an attention check question, they knew what the question was and what the answer should be, and programmed all of that into it. It was astounding. So what we ended up having to do is we now have a third-party government photo ID verification service at the beginning of our survey. So people will now consent to participate. They've got to pass the consent quiz, and they get redirected out to a third-party app that scans their driver's license. They have to take a selfie to make sure their face fits the face on the ID, that the ID is a US valid ID. It's crazy. Then they get bounced back to the survey if they pass all of that. And our hope is that that's going to be all we need to do. But it's been kind of crazy. So we relaunched this thing last week, and hopefully all is going well. So far it looks good, but just a word of warning on all of that kind of stuff. To give an update on the electronic medical records work, is that, again, as I mentioned, we're doing AI, large language models, scanning for clinical notes, because there's nowhere in our electronic health record where people can click a button that says this is a medical marijuana user, or I'm recommending medical marijuana for my patient. And so we're reliant on these clinical notes, which at aggregate is a overwhelming amount of information and research and data to try to collate. I didn't appreciate how good AI is at this stuff until now, and I'm amazed and astounded by it. So what we've done is our computer gurus have built these models. We trained the models by pulling example notes. And if it said, this patient's using CBD oil for anxiety, has been taking it twice a day for 2 years, and we can teach the computer to categorize that in meaningful ways and into bins, and run this analysis, and we can then deploy these models to our health record system and then upload it to other people so that they can do it. So as I mentioned, there's a global network that across 74 countries that has access to 810 million unique patients. And we could scale these models and these tools as we develop them out to other programs and other people to do their own stuff. So within Hopkins, what we've done is we trained this thing. We've obtained IRB permission to get access to the records for 810,000 patients that have a diagnosis of chronic pain, mood disorder, anxiety, PTSD, epilepsy, or autism. We rolled our tool out. We validated the tool. So when the tool says, yep, this person is a medical cannabis user, we can look at the actual clinical note and say, yep, that's correct. And it's amazing how accurate this thing is. And our initial classification run was done on 2.1 million records from over 800,000 patients. And we categorized them with a large language model on cannabis use status. So are they using cannabis at all? The frequency of use, the purpose of use, whether they're using a THC dominant, CBD dominant, or some hybrid, and whether they had cannabis use disorder. And so here's an example of the tool and what it looks like. So the patient note said, patient utilizing a 1-to-1 THC CBD tincture, 20 milligrams total, twice daily for neuropathic pain, secondary to diabetes, initiated 2 months ago. And so this thing, all the different color categories there indicate product type, dose, frequency, health condition, and duration of use. And so what we have now is a categorization for these patients where we have 171,000 patients and 1.36 million notes. So we've got multiple notes for the same patient where we know they're cannabis users. 44,000 patients are medicinal users, 19,000 of which are using THC dominant, 14,000 of which are using CBD dominant, 60,000 are inhaling it, 30,000 are using some other route. About 25,000 have some mention of risky use behavior, and 3,000 have some mention of cannabis hyperemesis. So now instead of looking at 2,000 people through our observational studies, we can look at 44,000 people at the click of a button and now categorize all of this stuff. So we can look at this at a much larger scale. And in addition to that, the other thing that we've done is we've developed tools for our electronic health record system that providers can use to actually, right in the medical record, click and categorize all of these specific things. So we developed a smart form that when the provider enters the clinical notes page, this little box pops up and they can populate it. This person's using cannabis. It's for medical purposes. It's a high THC oral dose formulation. Takes them 1 to 2 minutes of conversation with the patient. And now all of that data, instead of relying on that large language AI model, It's captured in hard data that can be exported in the future. And so we're trying to do that now at the patient or the provider level input. And then we're taking that cannabis use questionnaire and getting that programmed to be pushed out to patients ahead of visits. So that entire very detailed cannabis use questionnaire could also be integrated into the electronic health record simply by asking patients to do this quick 2-minute questionnaire before they come in for their visit. So where we're at now with this, and this is the furthest along where we are with all of this, is now that we've fine-tuned the model, we've identified 44,000 patients who are identified as medical cannabis users. We can now identify a demographically matched cohort that's not listed as a cannabis user and compare them with the cannabis users and look at healthcare utilization, concomitant medications, symptom management, and any other health related outcome that's in the electronic health record. I mentioned our data repository, so that is IRB approved, and we're seeking input. So anybody listening that has data that they'd be willing or interested in sharing with us, please email me. And we are managing data transfer agreements through the Hopkins Office of Research Administration. And for junior scientists listening who are interested in all of this data and all this stuff I'm talking about, our target with the repository is to accumulate enough data that by the end of this calendar year, we will start granting access to anybody with a hypothesis, an IRB approval or IRB exemption. And as soon as we kind of get all of that, we feel pretty good about it, we're going to be offering pilot grants to junior scientists who are interested in doing this work to help support their interest there. One last piece that I want to mention is we're also building out, we have a website for the Cannabis and Health Research Initiative. One page on the website is a research library. So it's a PubMed-like search engine, but you're only going to get medical cannabis related publications, and it's sortable by health condition, by species, by research methodology. And so it's a really neat way of very quickly and without a whole bunch of other noise seeing current research, and not even just current, it goes back. So we're building this out. We have over 3,000 articles now in the data library. And on our website, you can click any abstract or any article and see the abstract, and then with a direct link to the full text access out of the home journal outside of our website. So where we're at, I think, the EHR stuff is just fascinating, is going to enable us to really build this stuff up to big data to allow AI to kind of go in there and synthesize what would normally take us years to do. And will really drive a lot of what I see as future cannabinoid drug development, because I don't see this as a substitute for cannabinoid drug development, but rather as a funnel. So we take all of this data that's broad and aggregate, but we can synthesize all of this and identify particular health conditions and particular product types and have a basis for where to start with dosing to then go back to proper drug development and doing clinical trials and come up with better therapeutics for indications that people are using medical cannabis for, where there's inadequate other alternatives at the moment. And so really focusing in on things like autism, like PTSD, where you see a lot of patients gravitating towards therapeutic use of cannabis and cannabinoids, but where there's a large unmet need with current treatment approaches. And the more that we can use collaboration in terms of the putting all the data in one place and using the same assessments and common measures, the better we're going to be able to do that, and the faster we'll be able to get there. So I'm going to shut up now and hopefully take some questions. And I want to thank everybody who's been involved with this project. It really is a huge team. Again, calling out Johannes Thruel, Clarissa Madar, who's done all of the programming for us, and she's just an absolute saint. Heather Kimmel at NIDA, who this project was her brainchild, was to get NIH to support something like this, and everybody else that we've been involved with. Now, knowing there's only 6 minutes left for questions here, I'm happy to stay after 1 o'clock, and then anybody online who can't kind of get in on this, my contact information is here. You can shoot me an email. So thanks.
Yeah, so thanks for really a wonderful presentation. It's amazing what you have going. So as you said, we have a few minutes left for Q&A, but I want to encourage those in the audience and those online that we could take an extra 10 minutes or so. It's just such a wonderful presentation. I want to have, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So do we have some right there? Yeah, Mark.
Just want to echo what Steve said. Thank you for the fantastic presentation. You had a slide that was looking at, I believe it was self-selected high THC users, medical users in Maryland. And on the left-hand side, you showed self-reported subjective high. And then on the right-hand side, you showed improvements in anxiety and depression. And that leads me to believe that that subjective high is the mechanism of action for causing the improvement. But I know that that's not universally true. Like CBD has very little of that subjective high. And so to what extent do you think the improvements in symptom presentation are from the kind of like recreational high? And to what extent do you think they're from these less psychoactive, more biomedical interventions in the system?
Yeah, so that's what we're hoping to answer in our current program. So we didn't have high CBD product users in that cohort. We saw the reductions in anxiety and depression in the high CBD cohort, but we weren't post acute dosing assessing those folks. And so we wanted to take that piece of information and incorporate it into this larger new program of research so that we should be able to answer that question. Now, I don't think we can conclude that just because they reported feeling high and reduction in anxiety that you need to get high to have that reduction in anxiety. The great example of that is there's an Israeli company that's developing a vaporizer device that delivers very low levels of THC, and they're able to show reductions in chronic pain in their patients at 0.5 milligram or 1 milligram doses of THC. Again, over time, and it broadly speaking, we see reductions in anxiety and depression in folks taking very low THC containing products. Whether you see it acutely or whether that's just a part of a bigger, larger overall health change, you know, we'll hope to get there really soon with the current project.
I'm going to take a question from online.
Dylan says, thank you for a great talk. His question is, with synthetic cannabis products being primarily THC and plant derivative of cannabis containing different cannabinoids, is there any data on the interactions and or differences between the THC derivatives, and are you planning to look at that with your data?
So yeah, so the question here is there if I understand it correctly, is there a difference between synthetic cannabinoids and botanically sourced cannabinoids? And while there are synthetic cannabinoids that are not found naturally in the cannabis plant, the pharmacology for many of them is very similar. It's important to understand that there's diverse pharmacology of the phytocannabinoids, but whether synthetically derived THC that you find in dronabinol is different from botanically extracted THC, there's no data that I'm aware of that suggests there would be a difference unless you have a different enantiomer. But you know, we're not targeting that here, but we anticipate being able to potentially address that on an aggregate level through the EHR work, because we can identify people who are prescribed dronabinol, and then we would have the botanically kind of dispensary derived product users that we could compare in terms of efficacy and safety.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. So I was at CPA the other week and was listening to a talk by Justin Strickland, and I hope I don't butcher this, but I believe that what the evidence that he was presenting was showing that it could be that CBD in addition, so CBD on its own may not have like health benefits, but CBD in addition to THC could enhance the effects of the THC as opposed to THC alone. And so maybe suggesting that CBD might not have benefits on its own, but more of a drug on drug interaction where CBD can enhance the effects of other medication or other drugs. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, especially because of the slide that you had for the epilepsy patients who are showing better outcomes with CBD in addition to their medication as opposed to folks with just CBD.
So we've done a couple laboratory studies now, and others have shown this as well. CBD is a pretty potent inhibitor of multiple cytochrome P450 enzymes. And so it inhibits the metabolism of THC as well as the metabolism of a lot of other medications. So that's one of the concerns that providers need to be aware of, and patients in considering CBD, is that you may have to adjust the dose of other medications that you're taking down to account for that inhibition and metabolism. But I don't know that I don't think Justin's data means CBD by itself doesn't have any effect, but it very clearly increases THC's effects when it's orally ingested. And it's important to know that it's constrained to oral dosing. We don't see any indication of inhibition with inhaled dosing because you don't get first pass metabolism, and so the time course is such that you won't really get meaningful differences there. So hopefully that answers your question. And I do think that, again, we still need to understand, is there some magic to the full spectrum whole plant type extracts versus the isolated individual chemical entities, and understanding how individual components of the cannabis plant interact with each other.
Thanks for a great talk here. My question is about something you mentioned briefly, with looking forward to examining differences in adverse effects based on products that have been used by people. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the data you have already on this around people who respond differently to cannabis, and whether there are person level differences in those groups. Thinking anecdotally from patients, I've commonly heard people say, "Oh yeah, like cannabis, not for me. I've had this experience, didn't work out. I don't use it again, or causes too much anxiety." Anything to that, you think, in your data, or do you think it's really about what product they're using?
So I can speak very confidently to affirm your suspicion that people respond differently to the same dose of cannabis. We see that in our laboratory studies all the time, but that's not surprising, or it shouldn't be surprising, right? In medicine, the same dose of the same drug doesn't work for everybody, right? And so that, again, is kind of how I'm trying to approach all of this, and trying to, again, funnel information in trying to help us to determine which types of patients does medical cannabis most benefit, who does it not benefit, and who is it more risky for versus others. So we already know that THC in particular does not mix very well with people with psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, things like that. And there's definitely a genetic component on how the drug gets metabolized that can dictate differential response to the same dose, and why we would want to adjust doses up or down, or make different decisions based on other medications people are taking, their prior exposure or use history with THC or other cannabinoids. So we have to, again, I think generally medicine is going towards a personalized approach. So how can we leverage access to the EHR, the fact that there are millions of people using hundreds of different products right now? Can we collate that data in a meaningful way to then start having an informed recommendation to the person who tried everything and can't get a hold of their fibromyalgia, on where to start if they're going to consider medical cannabis use? So that's kind of how we're thinking about it. And then once we do go through the drug development pipeline, which I hope we get to, the idea there is that it's not going to be the cure-all for everybody with all of these health conditions. It's going to be, this is now a validated tool to be put in the physician's toolbox to help some people with this health condition, and which is how we approach most other therapeutics.
Yeah, I just want to say, as everyone else has said, thanks so much for a great talk. I was thinking a lot about how people that might use cannabis, they might be dual users of other drugs, particularly nicotine products. So do you expect, or do you maybe plan to look at use of other drugs like nicotine products when you're sort of analyzing this type of data? Because I imagine that you'll have access to it with the electronic health records. You may have access to that type of information if it's, recorded by a doctor or in a health setting, use of nicotine or cigarettes or whatever. So do you plan to maybe look at how use of other products may affect anxiety, depression, along with the medicinal cannabis use? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the simple answer is yes, we're absolutely going to look at that stuff. Fortunately, alcohol and tobacco are now fairly commonly reported, asked about in primary care visits and reported in electronic health records. And so we can utilize that information. In our observational prospective research study, we are asking about nicotine, alcohol, other illicit drug use, and other medication use. So again, co-use isn't restricted to drugs of abuse. And again, things like cigarette use is highly predictive of people with mood disorders and other health conditions, right? So we want to bring all of that stuff in. We are capturing that data so that we can look at it as a covariate or even as a particular area of interest. Now comes the hardest question.
I was thinking of the hardest question, but I don't know what it is. There's too many of them. Anyway, thanks, Ryan. So this is like a new area of work for you, right? So you're now on observational research and you're trying to make it the best you can and have quite a task in front of you, which is wonderful. But as a lab scientist, you're used to control, and you got to have control in your experiment, placebos, time, all those kind of things. And in this data, there is none. You can't control those things. So at what point, when you have this data in front of you and you haven't done the controlled trial yet, you feel comfortable with recommendations from physicians or whatever, particularly in line with potential adverse effects? So CBD, et cetera, there's some potential things like metabolism and maybe high doses, et cetera. When you start getting THC doses more than a few milligrams, then you have those kind of concerns. So yeah, that's kind of what I struggle with a lot. In this
case. And so I think, the way I've kind of thought about this is these are all different layers of control and confidence, right? To your point. And we don't have to rely solely on any one of these pieces to inform that decision and that recommendation. I think what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to build out more, again, to funnel things in, and we can look across all of those things. So we can look at the really nice, tightly controlled lab studies that we've done and others have done to say, yeah, a THC dose for a novice user shouldn't be any higher than 2.5 milligrams to start with. And, can we can we now look at where do people end up that are using it therapeutically, and what a titration schedule might look like. We kind of know we know CBD inhibits THC metabolism. So if you're starting with a THC dose of 2.5 milligrams, but it's a CBD dominant product, you might want to half the dose and start at 1.25 or something like that, because that would be different than a THC dominant product where you're starting at 2.5. And so we can use the lab data to inform some of that stuff, but I think we need these bigger natural history type data, because the way I'm looking at this is the cannabis legalization that's happened is an experiment, right? And we're just not capturing the data. And so I yelled at the Maryland State House as loud as I could for them to capture the data in the experiment that they were about to launch before they fully legalized medical cannabis, much less non-medical cannabis, and it fell on deaf ears. There are a couple states that actually listen to people and are collecting data and are requiring people to do these observational studies. But I don't think anybody's utilizing that data very well. The only group I can think of is the group in Michigan that publish papers every now and again on what kinds of people are using what products for what health conditions and looking at adverse events and things like that. But we literally have, I think, last number I saw is over 5 million registered medical cannabis users in the US. And we have no idea at the patient level how it's impacted them. And to me, it's a complete disservice to them and the general populace that we don't know the outcome of this experiment. So what I'm trying to do is to push us forward and let's get the information. We can understand the limitations of it at different layers, but somehow integrate it in a meaningful way where, again, we can say, okay, based on all of this stuff, we know in the lab this amount of THC is relatively safe. It does about this to social anxiety or whatever. And then at the higher level, at the observational study level, multiple observational studies in Australia and Germany and the Netherlands and in Illinois all seem to indicate people with this health condition seem to benefit from medical cannabis. And then at the big electronic health record level or the big data repository level, we can say, all right, yeah, that seems to map on, and most people kind of end up with a CBD dominant product and orally ingesting it. Then we can come in and run a proper clinical trial. We pick a product, define it, make sure it's replicable, and then do the study. But right now, if you were to be tasked with us, say, all right, which health condition do you pick is most likely to hit? What route of administration? What dose? Because you can only pick 2 doses, right, for your phase 2B study. What do you pick? You throw your hands up. You have no idea. So my hope is that with this, in 3 years, we probably have 2, 3, maybe 4 indications and a pretty good idea of the kind of product and the dose that we would start a clinical trial with. And then you can, I think, confidently invest funding into it. And I think that's why we don't have that funding now, is people like, what data do we have to feel confidence that doing that, it would be successful?
Well, I want to just commend you on your vision, your ambition,
I'll probably
your
kick myself
and
for
your
trying
guts
this
for
later, but-
tackling a big project like this. So it's really impressive. I'm struck by, like, within the past 6 days, I run into 2 separate projects where using generally the same idea of a top-down medical records discovery of potentially promising drugs. So I'm not sure if that's a trend, but I got a feeling with AI it may be. But congrats to you, and thanks for sharing the information with us. Very
Yeah.
exciting.
Thanks again for having me. It's been great being back in Burlington.